Hey, it's Josiah. On today's episode, I was joined by John from Christianity on the Spectrum, a podcast about the intersection of autism and Christianity. John's podcast is the result of about 10 years of research into the perspective of autistic Christians and ex-Christians. It's a really fascinating resource, and if you enjoy today's episode, it's definitely worth checking out John's show. But before we get into the episode proper, I do need to say that you can support Fruitless on Patreon. For a mere $3, you get access to 2 additional bonus episodes per month, as well as access to the Fruitless Discord server and the occasional deleted scene from a main feed episode. If you're not quite ready to commit to supporting financially, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. And hey, I may read your review at the top of an episode. All right, with all that out of the way, let's get on with the episode. You are listening to Fruitless, a podcast hosted by me, Josiah Sutton. This is episode 55, Autism and Christianity, featuring John from Christianity on the Spectrum. Going. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting episode of Fruitless. I am joined by John from Christianity on the Spectrum. Hello, John.
Hey, glad to be here. Very exciting.
So yeah, you've been doing this podcast now for a couple months, Christianity on the Spectrum. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that for anyone who's unfamiliar with your work?
Yeah, so basically I started a podcast that I launched, I think, back in October. Anyway, I started off doing a research project probably 10 years ago, where I started trying to answer a lot of questions that I just found personally interesting, but wasn't planning on doing anything or publishing anything or really doing anything of that matter. And then, eventually I just got such a critical mass of data. I got to the point where I'm like, I should probably publish things. And I kept talking to lots of people, and they kept asking me for resources about Christianity and autism. And there weren't any at all. And so I like there are some things that are out there, right? Like there are odd pockets of places, but I found myself having the same conversation with people over and over and over and over again. And so I figured, how about I just have this conversation once and put it somewhere and then point people to it. And so basically I got really fascinated by this question of what does Christianity look like when it intersects with autism, and more specifically what started it was so I was raised conservative evangelical. I tell people it's conservative evangelical. Technically it's Mennonite Brethren, but people don't know what that means.
No.
So just imagine conservative evangelicals.
I struggle with telling people I'm Episcopalian and them knowing what that means and just my daily life, Yeah.
So most people don't know what Mennonite Brethren means, but that's what I was raised. And then I left pretty shortly after going to university, just went through a pretty quick deconstruction, was an atheist. And then I found a whole bunch of other autistic people at an autistic meetup who had a story that was almost identical to mine. And I was like, this is so weird. Why did that happen? This can't be the only, is this just like a really weird trend in my little microcosm, or is this indicative of much broader trends? So I looked at the research that existed online, and it all seemed to suggest that there was some sort of negative correlation between Christianity and autism, but the reasons they gave I found were bad. I don't know what else to say. I read it and okay, you clearly don't understand Christianity or you don't understand autism.
Right.
And I was just like, I'm going to figure this out. So I'm a computer engineer. I'm really good at data science and scraping social media and things like that. And I just started collecting data and then started realizing that I could only go so deep with that. So I started reaching out to these autistic people I was finding online and being like, tell me about it.
Yeah.
Why'd you leave Christianity? Why are you a Christian? Whatever. And I sort of just kept doing that for 10 years. And here we are.
That's awesome. And it's a lot of really interesting, a lot of really interesting data that I think, you've been able to produce with this research. So, we already touched on this a little bit here, but, I wrote down just to ask you a little bit about the methodologies here. So you're primarily scraping a lot of this online.
Yeah. So basically, I spent a lot of time just going through various social media platforms, blogs, forums, things like that, where autistic people tend to congregate. And then I would find them. And then I would find ones who fit the criteria of being autistic and being either Christian or ex-Christian, and then scraping all of their posts and just gathering data all together. and then basically just reading through it. And I did that for a while. I've put out surveys, like a lot of surveys for autistic people. I've got like 15,000 total responses from various surveys I've sent out. And yeah, I've done long form interviews where I basically sit down and I talk to autistic people, just asking them about their experiences either with Christianity or leaving Christianity, and why they feel the way they do about things and what they feel about certain things, and sort of how those differ from other Christians and that type of thing. And so in total, I've identified 26,000 unique autistics on the internet who have some relationship to Christianity, and pulled and gone through their data, done all the analysis of that. And I've, at this point, conducted over 500 formal long-form interviews with Christians and ex-Christian autistics. And then I've also just had, hundreds at this point, more than 500 just conversations with other autistic people about their experiences. And just sort of correlating all that data and trying to make sense of it is what I've been trying to do and trying to articulate in the podcast, and hopefully it makes sense. But yeah, absolutely. And if people are interested in hearing some of those interviews, you use a lot of clips from them throughout the podcast, right? Yeah. I initially wasn't recording any of the conversations I was having, just because I wasn't planning on publishing a podcast or anything. I thought, maybe I'll write a book about this in the future, but I wasn't recording them. But then once I decided, actually, I'll probably make this into a podcast, I just decided to turn the record button on whenever I did an interview. And that's what you hear in the podcast. So, well,
to kind of get into your findings here, I think we should lay some groundwork and kind of ask the dumb question that I think is still important to ask. So, what is autism? Like, kind of a basic description, assuming somebody knows very little about it.
Yeah, so it's this thing where, after you get vaccinated, it just sort of I'm joking. For the record, vaccines do not cause autism, but anyway. So there are lots of ways to describe it, right? And so there are like specific diagnostic criteria that you'll get from like the diagnostics and statistics manuals. You'll get various definitions that are all about. And I think the easiest way to describe it is it's a different way of your brain being structured. And it particularly affects the way that you experience the world sensorily, the way that you think about social relationships, and the way that you interact with people socially, and the way that you process interpersonal relationships. And it also affects various things like how you process data, how you look at data, and the ways, like different interests and frequencies and intensities. And so that isn't a particularly good definition if you don't know what you're talking about. But basically, I would say it's a different brain type, and it's a different brain type that affects the way that you socialize, and also the way that you focus on and think about information. We tend to be more on the intense side of things, very, very focused, very, very specific. And of course, with autism, there comes a whole bunch of things. One of the ones that you'll see most frequently are like sensory issues or stimming. And so a lot of us are hypersensitive or hyposensitive. So either too much or too little of any sort of sensory experience. And then also there's aspects of like what we in the autistic community call stimming, or like repetitive movement, things like that. You'll see a lot of. And within autism, we used to have various labels for it. So we used to have what was called Asperger syndrome, and then high functioning autism and low functioning autism or severe autism, all these different terms. And we've basically just condensed them all into what is now called autism spectrum disorder, and specifically autism spectrum disorder, autism with 3 different numbers, basically autism 1, autism 2, and autism 3. Autism 1 being low support needs, so that is what used to be called Asperger syndrome or high functioning autism. And that's where like the vast majority of my research is focused on, is autism 1 or autism with low support needs.
Sure.
And then there's autism with high support needs. So that's autism 2. And then autism 3 is substantial support needs, where you would like need a person to take care of you on almost 24/7 basis.
Sure.
Like there are various different experiences within the autism spectrum that are all pretty distinct from each other. But the vast majority of my data is taken on autism 1. And so it's that sort of high functioning, what used to be called Asperger syndrome. So like I was diagnosed with Asperger syndrome. So yeah, hopefully that explains it.
No, absolutely. No, I think that's really helpful here. So from there, I think I'm going to go to a question that you had said on your podcast that you hate this question. So I'm going to ask the question you hate, the loaded one, so you can explain why the question is wrong. So why are autistic people less likely to be Christian?
Yeah, great question. So this is a very layered question, and it has a lot of different components to it, right? And so there are a lot of different answers to this, and there are a lot of good answers and there are a lot of bad answers. If you go to like the peer-reviewed scientific literature, it'll say things like it's caused by mentalizing deficits or something like that.
Sure.
Not the case, by the way. I understand what most people are asking when they ask that question. And so just to answer that, the quick and short answer as to why autistic people are less likely to be Christian is basically that the way that we do and practice Christianity often doesn't have autistic people in mind.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much the easiest, shortest answer that I can give to it, which is to basically say we think about Christianity in a way that isn't thinking about autistic people. And so when we're talking about a way that your brain is configured that thinks about and conceptualizes relationships and social relations very differently than other people's brains might. And you're talking especially about a religion with large relational components to it, like Christianity. The way that you communicate these sort of relational ideas is going to vastly differ between how autistic people would sort of intuitively think about things and how non-autistic people would intuitively think about things. And that's just one aspect of like 7 that we go into. Of the various things, but it basically just comes down to there isn't anything about autistic people that is inherently less religious or less Christian. It's just the way that we practice and do Christianity is done in a way that isn't really open or conducive to autistic Christian spiritual practice. And that's sort of the short answer. The long answer is like, okay, well, what does Christian actually mean in this context? And Christian in this context mostly means like modern Western American Christianity in most cases when people are asking me this. And like, are we less likely to be Christian, or are we just less likely to be this specific type of Christian? And it's clear, like just from all the numbers that I've been able to gather, all the data that I've been able to gather, it's very, very clear that we are less likely to be this version of Christian or the version of Christianity that's often given to us, but less likely to be Christian as a whole. Like, are there certain forms of Christianity that autistic people would be way more likely to want to participate in if it was offered to them? Absolutely. But those things aren't offered to them, right? And so, you're giving them an option of something that isn't really appealing, doesn't appeal to them, doesn't really make sense to them. They're not going to want to be it, and that's basically just it.
Yeah, I think one of your someone you had a clip from an interview you had played, someone you were interviewing had talked about the similarities between the experience of autistic Christians and then like evangelicals broadly, and I kind of see what you're saying in relation to that too, where I think a lot of evangelicalism is oriented around this identification with one specific expression of Christianity being the valid one. And very much, equating American evangelicalism in the 21st century with Christianity writ large. Yeah. And so then you give someone a binary between that. Do you want this specific expression of Christianity that's probably actively hurting you or feels false to you in some way, or atheism? Most people are just going to choose the atheism. So it speaks less to autistic people's ability to engage in religious thinking or in Christianity, and more with the church in America's inability to like be welcoming to autistic people.
Yeah, that's exactly it, right? Because like when you say Christianity, this includes like the Pentecostal Americans doing whatever it is they're doing, and also includes like, I don't know, Syriac Christians doing something completely different. And when you look at those, like they're so different in the way that they go about things and so different in the way that they practice things that it's like, okay, asking why they're less likely to be Christian when Christianity is such a broad and diverse tradition might not be the best question.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. But
yeah,
anyway,
so because someone would be like, well, I'm not Christian because of this. I struggled with speaking in tongues and this outward emotional expression of Christianity. It's like, all right, that's a very small chunk of Christianity that's very popular just in the US, or not just the US, but
that's something that I've heard a lot from autistic people who are raised within Pentecostal circles.
Sure, yeah.
They say, I'm not a Christian. And when I ask them why, they're like, well, I never had these ecstatic emotional experiences. I could never get myself to speak in tongues none of this ever made sense to me. And you do get a lot of that. But also going like, hey, well, are you sure that's Christianity or not just a specific culturally contingent mode of Christianity?
Yeah, I mean, that was a big thing for my own, like, leaving the faith and returning to it, is just that I have really chronic depression. So I don't have the ability to control my emotional state very easily. And so when Christianity was, to me, was expecting me to have these, ecstatic religious experiences, then I'm like, well, then I'm not one of the elect, I guess. I guess God hates me.
Yeah. Oh, no, that's super common with autistic people as well. Also because there's a large intersection between autism and depression and other mental health issues.
Right.
But yeah, like it's wild. See that a lot.
Yeah. Well, so I guess getting now into some specifics here, what are like specific issues with the church, with American Western expressions of Christianity that tend to drive autistic people away?
Oh boy. Yeah. Where to begin with that? That's, so there are all sorts of issues, and I try to lay them out in the podcast as coherently as I can in the sort of order in which I hear them. So the most common issues that I hear about where autistic people who have deconverted or deconstructed say, like, this was my biggest issue, is basically doctrinal issues. So autistic people are, one of the things you'll find with a lot of us is we're extremely systematic. We are very, very thorough, very precise in our thinking, very much interested in nailing down specifics, and also just like correlating that with other experiences. And so one like very, very common story you'll hear is young earth creationism, for example, being like pushed as like, you must believe this. And like, the Ken Ham answers in Genesis style, if this brick gets pulled off the wall, the whole wall will fall over. And the autistic people take that quite literally and go, okay, great. So the entire gospel hinges on whether or not Genesis 1 is literal 6-day creation.
Right.
And,
it's really irresponsible, I think, to be saying that, to be like, okay, this entire faith is contingent on this thing where the vast majority of evidence, if the person chooses to actually research this, points the opposite direction.
Yeah, exactly. And so they'll hear that and they'll go, oh, okay. So autistic people tend to be very literal minded, tend to take things at face value as you say it, not very good at reading like subtext or things like that. And they'll hear, okay, so it's either I'm a young earth creationist or I'm an atheist. I can't deal with young earth creationism anymore. Guess I'm an atheist. And it happens a lot. Like for me, it didn't quite happen that way, but that was a very, very important part for me. So for me, I was like raised young earth creationist, the whole 9 yards. And I got to university, quickly realized that evolution was actually true and that the evidence support for it was sort of overwhelming and that there was like no real good reasons to reject it. And in terms of the evidence that was available. And that threw me for a massive loop. And I had to think, okay, what do I do now? Luckily, I did find some good resources that were there to tell me that, like, actually, you can be a Christian still. Ken Ham is, in fact, wrong.
Yeah.
It is possible to accept the ideas of Christianity without taking Genesis 1 as a literal historical account of creation as it took place. But then after that happened, I started to realize, I need to rethink all these things. And so I started just researching the Bible, just learning about all the things that were there, and started to realize that not only was I wrong about young earth creationism, but actually when you start to study the Bible academically, not just in like a Bible study context where everyone's sort of coming together to pool their collective ignorance. Like once you actually get into the scholarship, things get quite complicated quite quickly. And so another thing that comes up a lot is the doctrine of inerrancy. Again, autistic people get really precise in their thinking, and you say, well, the Bible is inerrant, and they go, but it looks like there's an error here.
That cannot be true. Right.
Yes. And I can't hold these two views simultaneously. And they'll go, well, look, this apologetic explains it. And so a very common example that I heard about a lot is in Matthew and Luke, both the Gospels, they start off with a genealogy. The genealogies are different. Like just there's no debate about names in them. Yeah. Look at the names. The names and the sequences of names are different.
Yeah, you don't need to be a Bible scholar to be able to do this. You just need two copies of the Bible.
You need to have pattern recognition. That is the only requirement to see that one.
Right.
And so there are really 4 options you have, right, when you look at that. And the 4 options you have are Luke is wrong, Matthew's right. Matthew's wrong, Luke is right. Matthew is right, Luke is right, or both are wrong.
Yeah.
Those are your 4 options that you have. Because fundamentally, when it comes down to it, how do you prove that it's both Matthew and Luke are right? There are all sorts of apologetics to try to explain it, but fundamentally, at the end of the day, how do you know which one of those to accept? And the answer is you don't. Right? There's nothing that tells you this is the correct interpretation of this, because that's sort of just not what's in the biblical text. And there are, of course, like, if anyone does any academic study of the Bible, you will come across all these like issues and problems, and like, famously the synoptic problem of figuring out which texts came from which other texts, and the genealogy of the development of the synoptic gospels coming from Mark into Luke, Matthew, and how those things come about, and how those different accounts have slightly different narratives in them. It all gets very complicated. And when you have a Christianity that basically says, this is inerrant, this is perfect, and this is absolutely true, and a mind that takes things very literally and at face value, it goes, okay, well, either your claim is right or your claim is wrong, and I see these issues here, you're more likely to be wrong. Okay, I'm out. Like that those are just some issues. And especially like in modern contexts. So a really, really big thing that I see a lot of is autistic people love apologetics. Like love apologetics, especially as teenagers. And so autistic people, the primary method through which they interact with their faith is through intellectualization. So if you were to survey autistic people and just, as I've done, and just ask them about their faith, they are extremely intellectually engaged. And so when you are a precocious 14-year-old at your youth group and you're asking all these questions, what's your youth pastor going to do? He's going to give you like William Lane Craig or Lee Strobel and The Case for Christ. And as a 14-year-old, this shit is going to be awesome, right? Sorry.
Yeah.
I didn't check. Am I allowed to swear
before
this?
Of course. Yeah, yeah. You listened to Mammonberg. We were.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, I just didn't know on this one if I was allowed
no, you're good. You're good.
Yeah. Yeah, you like read Lee Strobel as a 14-year-old, read The Case for Christ, you're like, oh, this shit is fire. Like this is the best. This is the stuff because it's very logical, it's very systematic. It seems like it's very well supported. And a lot of apologetics and a lot of modern apologetics is sort of takes this attitude of we can the reason that you should hold to the Christian faith is because we can prove it, right? And it creates this really high bar of certainty for people, where they sort of go into Christianity thinking you can actually prove all these doctrines. And the reason you believe them is because this is where the best evidence points to. And then you get into the actual scholarship of it, and it's like, actually, it's really complicated, and you can't draw firm conclusions, and the data don't actually point you to these really specific conclusions held by conservative evangelicals, and the reality of the situation is actually kind of complicated. And that, those factors also, like, lead autistic people to go, it's all wrong. Because so there's this thing with autistic people, I call it the 1% principle, which is this sort of phenomena where autistic people will look at a problem, and if they can't agree with it 100%, like if they're just 99% sure, they'll, like on surveys, they're 99% sure, and they'll check no, because they're like, there's 1% chance that I could be wrong. And so I'm going to default no, because that's the safe. It drives me insane trying to design
as a researcher, because I think you mentioned in the show at one point, like the difficulty with asking asking someone if they identify as Orthodox, like lowercase o Orthodox. And you're just more meaning like, do you think the resurrection happened? Like these more large scale doctrinal issues, and they're like saying no, but it's because they have like one gripe with the Council of Chalcedon.
And that's a surprisingly common one. And they're like, well, I don't think we should have condemned the Miaphysites, so technically that puts me in the non-Orthodox space, so I'm going to say no, I'm not Orthodox. God damn it, people. That's not what I'm asking. But yeah, so you get those effects in with like I think like the modern apologetics industrial complex has been a disaster for autistics. I mean, a disaster for everyone in general, but like particularly the amount of damage that it's done to autistic people and the amount of deconstruction that it's caused in autistic people from just setting the bar of expectations and methodology so high that like no one could cross it unless they were delusional. And like, I don't know, they're just shooting themselves in the foot. So like that's the biggest one, is doctrinal issues where they are told Christianity is a very rigid, specific set of beliefs. And if you cannot hold to all of these with 100% certainty, like you're not doing Christianity, right? And Christianity is all about like convincing yourselves that these things are true intellectually, and that is the entire purpose of Christianity. And so that leads them to deconstruct when they find that they can't do that. And again, because autistic people, the primary way they engage with Christianity is through intellectualization, you would expect that the primary way that they leave Christianity is through intellectual difficulties. So that also isn't surprising. But then another big factor is like Christian relational doctrines. So like I had mentioned, autistic people often struggle with understanding relationships and conceptualizing relationships in the way that most people do. So that isn't to say autistic people don't have relationships or don't form relationships. We absolutely do, right? We absolutely form relationships. We do all these things. We just do it differently than most people. And we think of relationships very differently than most people. Like, I often explain that when I'm conceptualizing my relationship with my wife, I conceptualize myself sitting in front of like a nuclear control panel at a nuclear reactor, and I'm like trying to balance all the various levels of things and like turn all the right dials to keep everything in homeostasis to make sure that a meltdown doesn't happen. And that's sort of how I conceptualize my very loving relationship with my wife. Not at all how my wife conceptualizes a relationship with me. But when you're talking about Christianity, and very common thing you'll hear is, do you have a personal relationship with Jesus? Or what does your relationship with Jesus look like? And you're autistic, and so you think of relationships completely different than everyone else. The language that people are using to describe relationships to you is completely foreign and is confusing and doesn't make any sense, because that's not at all how you think about relationships. Like, one of the questions that I asked in every interview that I did with autistic people is, do you have a personal relationship with Jesus, or is this concept even coherent for you? Or ex-Christians, asking them, did you have a personal relationship with Jesus? Was this concept coherent for you? And 85% of autistics across the board said no. Like, no, I don't have a relationship with Jesus. Yeah, and they're like, this idea doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah.
But now think of how Christianity is described in most cases, right? It's not
you can see the problem.
It's not a
here.
religion, it's a relationship. And you have these people who are like, the idea that I can have a relationship with someone that I can't see is absurd. Like, this is not a category of relationship that I even recognize as valid. And a lot of them will say, look, I know I'm supposed to say yes, but I don't actually know what that means. Like, I'm just going to level with you here, John. I don't know what you mean when you say personal relationship with Jesus, but I say yes because most people mean, when they ask that, are you a Christian? And I'm a Christian. I'm just not really sure what this whole thing is dealing with.
Yeah.
And so, like, that obviously causes huge amounts of tension and huge amounts of issues for autistic people. And then there are also just like social issues with church, like autistic people. Unfortunately, there is a lot of church abuse with autistic people. There are a lot of issues, a lot of, especially in more Pentecostal charismatic circles, people being accused of having demons because they aren't speaking in tongues, and having the autism exorcised out of them, and having like healings to get rid of their autism, and they don't even know why that's happening. And oftentimes they're like, yeah, I want to be like you guys. I want to understand things like you guys are. And they'll go through some pretty traumatic experiences there, to say the least. And then there are also just like social perception issues. So churches can be very sensorily overwhelming. Autistic people aren't really good at dealing with a lot of overwhelming environments. Lots of lights, lots of sounds, lots of people touching you when you don't want to be touched, that type of thing. That can just be very difficult, and just a lot of difficulty understanding what the church is and how people should be acting there. Often they will have very high expectations for people in the church, and then get extremely disappointed when they do not meet those expectations, which I personally think are quite reasonable. But people in churches are flawed, to say the least, and a lot of them don't always do good things, and so that comes up quite a bit. But basically, how I describe it is a cognitive dissonance pressure cooker, right? So you get all these factors, and there's never one reason an autistic person leaves Christianity. It is always like death by 1,000 cuts. And so I explain it in the metaphor of a cognitive dissonance pressure cooker. Like, cognitive dissonance is mental discomfort with things that don't align with your expectations, or when things don't align with how you see the world. And so you're forced to hold two contradictory ideas in your head, and you need to resolve that or it'll cause discomfort. And everyone deals with cognitive dissonance to some extent, and everyone has a certain capacity and tolerance for cognitive dissonance. It just so happens autistic people have a significantly lower capacity for cognitive dissonance.
Sure.
Things that cause cognitive dissonance cause way more cognitive dissonance. And the opportunities for cognitive dissonance are much larger within the autistic community. And so
in part because of the intellectualization, I assume, too, right? Because you start seeing more holes.
Yes. And often we are much more morally sensitive to things in a way than most people. Like one really big event. So I started collecting data in 2014. And one thing that I noticed was when the BLM riots started, and like the sort of social unrest around Black Lives Matter started, a lot of autistic people thought, maybe naively, they're like, oh, there's the right side to be on this issue is with the people protesting. And then they go to their church, and their church is like, we need to bring in the National Guard to machine gun these people down. And they go, wait a second. No, we don't. That's not how we're supposed to think about this. Also, with the election of Donald Trump in 2016, a lot of autistic Christians were, obviously would think, or maybe not obviously, I don't know anymore, but like they would look, they would look at a figure like Donald Trump, and they would say, okay, this person, I've been told my whole life that this is the type of person that we should not trust, who is like a sign of everything bad in the world and all this. Obviously, we're not going to support him, right? And then, nope, turns out the whole church is supporting him. The whole church is behind him, and it's like, what the hell is going on? And so there are also those sorts of things that led to it. Like the election of Donald Trump actually led to a significant spike in autistic deconversion stories. It spiked up from the base rate normal by like 223%. After 2016. So it's just like massive spike in posts of autistic people being like, I am leaving Christianity, and I'm leaving it because of this. But so it's always like a collection of these reasons where eventually the pressure tank just gets too much, and something happens and the top blows off of it, and then everything just comes out, and they're like, there isn't enough keeping me in, so I'm just going to go out. And that's another factor. Like the church is often very difficult for autistic people. It's more rare to find autistic people who are like, I always had a great relationship with church, and it was my happy place, and it was my comfort place growing up, and it was the place where I felt safe. Generally speaking, you don't hear that. And so, and generally speaking, they don't have a super positive relationship with it. So if you have all these negative pressures pushing them out and very few positive pressures trying to keep them in, it sort of just makes sense that you would see most of them just go out the door. And so that's basically what happened. And that's the very long answer to why they leave.
No, I think there's a lot to that. And, again, like I had said off mic before we started recording, I'm going to try not to think too hard about the fact this lines up really, really nicely with my own experience. But just going to not think about that. But yeah, because I mean, I 2016, I was in the midst of going through the that intellectual deconstruction type stuff you're talking about here with like the more the apologetics questions. I was already going through that. And then Trump won the election at the end of that year. And that was kind of just the final straw.
Yeah. Many such cases.
Yeah. And that makes sense. I also think like you're describing kind of the social stuff with church being an aspect of it and the intellectualization being an aspect of it. I also see how those two relate, because I think a lot of churches are incredibly hostile to somebody being, having a very intellectual relationship with Christianity. And, that can either be like taking it as an, attack because it's like you're questioning me, or it's more like, you don't actually get it because you're not having this kind of emotional relational thing like, neurotypical me has. So you must actually not get it. You must just be doing this because, you're more interested in God as a thought problem or whatever, and kind of just treat it as, as a lesser form of spirituality or religious conviction.
And there's actually like a name that I've given to this exact phenomena that I call the Bible study problem. So one of the most common features of autistic Christian experiences is the experience I call, so there are a few of them. So one I sort of jokingly refer to it as the universal autistic Christian experience, which is you're at like does the term like cry night resonate with you?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like,
a big social evangelical gathering where we're sharing spiritual, emotional kind of shit, and people are bawling about how much Jesus loves them and how much they've sinned and stuff like that.
It's the last day of Bible camp, or a big praise and worship service. The altar call's about to come out, and it's like high emotion, high intensity, and everyone's really feeling it, and you're sitting there looking around like, what the hell is going on? What is wrong with these people? I am not feeling this. I don't get it. Virtually every autistic person I've spoken to, with a few exceptions, has had that exact experience, and that has often led to like a serious questioning of like, okay, so there are really like only two options here. Either everyone's making this up and this is stupid, or they're not making it up and God doesn't love me.
Yeah, I'm not in the club.
Like
right, yeah.
There's all these, like, they're the elect and they're not the elect. Clearly, this is, if anything, this is a sign that I'm not part of them.
Yeah.
And so that's one aspect, but the other one is the Bible study problem, which is that autistic people being very intellectually engaged and very intellectually interested and primarily expressing their Christian faith through intellectualization mistake the Bible study for being a place to intellectually engage.
Right.
And they mistakenly believe that the purpose of the Bible study is to study the Bible.
Right.
It's not. And so they'll bring up problems and they'll bring up issues, and they'll very quickly be like flagged as a problem, or like, why are you questioning this? Or the pastor will say something that's just not true.
Yeah.
And they'll go up to them after the service and be like, okay, you said that like Christians were persecuted for the first 3 centuries of Christianity, but that's not actually completely accurate. Like persecution in the early church was sporadic, localized, and specific to these cases and these instances. And then the pastor will be like, are you challenging my authority? Or something like that. Or they'll be like, well, I read this other thing somewhere that said something else. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to like engage with their faith. But what other people think they're trying to do is cause problems, or like cause other people to stumble. Or a lot of autistic people, one of the ways that they really deeply intellectually engage with their faith is by thinking through problems, and by bringing problems up, and by talking about problems. And a lot of people don't like talking about problems with the Christian faith. And so when your whole thing is like meditating on the nature of God through thinking about the problem of suffering, and you're in a Bible study where no one has ever thought about the problem of suffering, and you're the first one bringing it up, like, why do animals die in forest fires? Like, why did God create a world in which animals sort of needlessly die in forest fires? There's nothing redemptive about this. Suffering isn't helping anyone. Why do we live in this world? And they're like, wow, you must hate God.
Right. Oh, man. No, this specific example, I think I relate to, especially because I gravitated right to, my undergrad thesis and for philosophy thesis in college was on the problem of evil. And it's because it was the apologetic argument that I had the hardest time with, like the anti-Christian argument that I don't think there's a good answer to. So that's why I went there. And it's something I found very fruitful in my faith, is engaging with, the hardest question.
Yeah,
and I
think people don't really like when you bring up hard questions in Christianity. It's not exactly encouraged in most places. And there's sort of a like, get with the program, we're all here to do this, and you're off here talking about the synoptic problem. Maybe come back and let's not talk about the various issues with the text here.
let's talk about your personal relationship with Christ.
let's talk about and it's like, no, my personal relationship with Christ is fine. I just want to know why Matthew took this Isaiah prophecy, which is supposed to say that Jesus was born of a virgin, but that's a misinterpretation of what's going on in Isaiah, because that whole prophecy isn't talking about the Messiah. It's talking about this whole other... Anyway, they're like, wow, you must hate God.
Yep, that must be it. Yeah. Kind of pivoting here a bit, but one thing I was kind of wondering, and maybe this was on an episode I didn't get to, but I think is interesting here is how do these experiences differ between Catholic versus Protestant? And then even within Protestantism, like evangelical versus like high church Protestantism?
Yeah. So it's a very complicated question, right? Mm-hmm. Because even within Catholicism, there are lots of different types of Catholicism. But I think one of the ways to answer this question is to basically say there is a phenomenon that is extremely common within autistics. It is so common that like it is actually very weird for me when I find exceptions to the rule, and I call it high church drift, which is that basically if you start off in a low church tradition, as you get older, the chances that you will migrate to a high church tradition become higher and higher as you age. And so like by the time, if you're autistic, by the time you get to age 30, if you're not in a high church tradition of some sort, that's an anomaly. And it's for a lot of reasons, right? Like it's high churches are often just more accommodating to the specific needs of autistic people. Mm-hmm. So when you think of the average like low church Protestant service, what happens? You go into the service, someone gets up and talks. Then you play a bunch of music, often too loud. Often many autistic people complain about the content of the music. And
the vacuousness of the lyrics or whatever.
Yes,
right?
Their desire to sing about something other than Jesus being their boyfriend. And then someone gets up and basically talks to you, and then gets up and talks to you again. And that's the service. It's basically just you sit there and someone talks at you. And autistic people often have like communication difficulties and verbal processing difficulties and things like that. And when you look at a liturgical church, what is it? Mostly like it is a multi-sensory ceremony where people are walking around. You're standing up, you're sitting down, you're doing this prayer, you're doing that prayer. And not only that, it is extremely predictable. You know exactly what's going to come. You know when it's going to come. You know why it's going to come. If you want to, you can look into why every single part of the liturgy is the way it is, and there's some sort of intellectual explanation for it. And it's very easy to be very intellectually engaged with it. And the sort of apex of the service isn't a 40-minute sermon. It is the Eucharist, which is another sort of multi-sensory experience where your primary goal isn't to sublimate the talking points of your pastor. It is to engage in a religious ritual. And autistic people, when they practice religion, love religious ritual. Like it's a very large part of the way that they practice, and formulated prayers, things like that. And so I've just found across the board, autistic people almost always move to those high church traditions. That isn't to say if they are raised in those high church traditions that they'll stay in it. You know, I hear lots of stories of deconstructing Catholics and things like that. That isn't really a anomaly or anything like that. It's just significantly higher rates of deconstruction in low church Protestantism, and significantly higher rates of migration from low church Protestantism often to high church Protestantism, to be honest, often to like the Episcopal Church or the Anglican Church, depending on where you are.
Yeah, it's liturgical, but we haven't touched too much on this, but social issues, they're better on social issues.
Liturgical, but also don't make hating gay people like a central part of their identity.
Right.
That's often it.
Yep.
Usually when they'll say I wanted to, or I was looking at like Catholicism, but I didn't really like that they didn't allow women to be ordained, and they weren't super cool on gay people. And then I found the Anglican Church, and they were cool with both of those things, and so I jumped on board.
Yep. Pretty similar trajectory for me too. I think that's really interesting. And that also makes sense. This kind of moves us to, I think, next, kind of the question, because we've talked a lot about people leaving the faith and that, but then the question is, okay, so then what is an autistic Christianity generally look like then? Which I know you have a lot of data on as well, right? Like, not just what pushes people out of the faith, but also like, what is it that they, autistic Christians find attractive about the faith, and how does their understanding of Christianity differ from, neurotypical people?
It's a great question, and it takes a while to explain. I think the episode
you have a 2 hour and 40 episode, 2 hour and 40 minute episode on this.
It's very long. That's where you can get the detailed explanation for it. But basically, it looks like a very intellectually engaged, ritualistically heavy practice that is particularly concerned with issues of morality, is basically the way that I would say it. So those three components play very heavily into Christian autistic practice. So the first one, intellectualization; the second one, ritual and ritualized practice; and the third one is a very strong focus on morality and ethics. And so it looks like basically a combination of those three things. When I sort of defined autistic Christianity, what I did is I took a set of tendencies towards and tendencies away from, and I basically just said, these are all the tendencies that autistic people tend to gravitate towards, and these are the tendencies they tend to gravitate away from. And the list is quite long of things that they gravitate towards or away from. But in general, the overall thing that it looks like is deeply intellectually engaged. Like if you want to figure something out within theology, one of the best things to do is just find your local autistic guy in your congregation and ask him, because if he doesn't know, he's got a book that he can send you, or he'll know someone who does, or she'll already have thought out the answer to it. It's a fairly common thing. That's basically what it looks like.
Sure. Well, and one thing I found fascinating about that specific episode about autistic Christianity was that and it was something you had said you were surprised about with the data, was that autistic Christians tend to really struggle with liberal theology. They tend to like liberation theology, but they really don't tend to like liberal theology. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah. So that was something that completely surprised me. So when I started this research project, I had deconverted. So I should mention I've come back to the faith. So I reconverted 4-ish years ago. But basically, I expected almost everyone to be liberal Christians, and I expected them to be liberal Christians because I couldn't wrap my head around how you could be a Christian and not have all these sort of doctrinal issues. Right? Yeah. Like, especially for me, I was like, I can't wrap my head around that. At the time, I couldn't. And so I expected if you were Christian, you were likely to be in a branch of Christianity that was more liberal. However, I've found that was absolutely not the case. The vast majority of autistics I call, so they're lowercase o orthodox, but usually on the fringes of orthodoxy is how I describe it. So they often know where the line is, and they stay just inside of it.
Right. So
you'll find a lot of them who are like universalists or hopeful universalists in a way that technically doesn't make them heretics. Right. They're like, no. You see, Gregory of Nyssa, he had this conception of
Karl
the restoration of all things. Yes.
Right. Yeah.
And so but the overwhelming majority of practicing autistic Christians are that sort of lowercase o orthodox and take that quite seriously, and are very intent on maintaining orthodoxy to a large degree. And it makes up a fairly fairly large part of their practice. And one of the reasons I found that is a sort of survivorship biasing effect, where if most autistic Christians who go to a more liberal theology eventually kind of ask themselves, what's the point?
Right.
And we're very literal thinkers, right? We tend to not be super great at metaphor, not be very great at that sort of abstract,
the main liberal theology things,
way of thinking. Yeah, basically all the ways that liberal theologians tend to think tend to not resonate with us very deeply, and the ways that more orthodox thinkers tend to resonate with us more closely. And so what I found instead was that instead of being theologically liberal, what instead changes is your sort of epistemological orientation towards orthodoxy, where you will hold an orthodoxy, but you will also say, I'm orthodox. I cannot prove my orthodox doctrine, though. So, like, I believe that Jesus was raised on the third day and, ascended into heaven and all that stuff. Yes. Do I think I can provide you a compelling historical case for why that happened? No. But, I'm assenting to these beliefs, not because I believe, like I used to, that Lee Strobel was completely right in the case for Christ. But for other reasons is basically what you'll get with them.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, aside from that, I think one thing that I'm just interested in is what are some of the most surprising results you found? I mean, obviously we know the liberal theology one, but were there any other results you got that you hadn't expected going in?
Oh yes.
Oh yeah, good.
Okay, so oh god.
I opened the door here.
So before I say this, I'll say this is descriptive, not prescriptive. I'm not saying you should do this. I'm not saying this is a good thing. I'm just calling it how I see it. So one phenomenon which I didn't expect, and this might require a bit of pre-explanation because some people might not be aware of trends and changes and things like that. But basically, across every demographic that I've been able to find, and every demographic that has been polled, people in general, when you split them by gender, women are always more inclusive of trans people than men. So this was true with autistic Christians.
Yeah.
Until around 2017.
Okay. Oh, God. Okay.
And then autistic Christian women and autistic Christian men started to align, not because autistic Christian men became more affirming, but because autistic Christian women were becoming less affirming, and then sort of fell off a cliff from there, where autistic Christian men are actually far more likely to be trans affirming than autistic Christian women when you look at it, which didn't expect to see that. And I sort of, I watched that happen. Like I was taking...
You were watching that data change. Wow.
Yeah, I was watching that data change. And not only was I watching that data change, I was having autistic Christian women come up to me and be like, hey, we did this interview 6 months ago, and I know that you care about like changes in data, because one of the things I say in interviews is like, if you change your mind on any significant issue, please let me know. I want to know. And they're like, by the way, I have completely rethought my position on sex-based rights or something. And they say that, and it's like, I know
that's
what
one of those
means.
phrases I don't love.
It's like, okay, cool, I guess. Sick. Tell me, what do you think, and why do you think that? And I always have a very neutral, non-judgmental approach to things, and so they just tell me. Right. And often, I would talk to autistic Christian women, and they would tell me in the interview that they were trans affirming. And then as I built and developed a trust relationship with them, they'd be like, slowly let the mask slip. To be like,
sure.
3 months later, they'd be like, I think sometimes people are a little too hard on the TERFs. And 6 months later, they'd be like, I do think they make some good points. And I do think that women are entitled to single-sex spaces. And then 6 months later, they'd be like, I've been a TERF for 3 years. I just thought I'd let you know. And it's like, okay,
God.
Cool. Yeah, so that was a really surprising thing that I didn't think I would see happen.
What do you have a theory of what happened there, or is theories, it just yes. Okay? Do you have ones you're willing to share?
Yeah, sure. So Brexit. No. Kind of joking, kind of not.
Yeah, I mean, 2017, I hear that year and I can think of some stuff, but yeah.
So to understand the phenomena, you have to understand the gender politics that were going on in the UK and the turf wars that were happening in the UK, specifically around trans inclusion, because these are fairly important. So people kind of joke that the UK is turf island, but it wasn't always that way. And in fact, the conservatives were the ones who were actually going to put forward self-ID legislation, which would allow a person to basically identify as whatever gender they would want, and that would be their legal gender. And this was all happening, and these things were going forward. It was sort of seen as the next frontier of civil rights. But then there was this vocal opposition, and the vocal opposition mostly came from the left, and it came from radical feminists, or trans exclusionary radical feminists who were opposing this, and they were basically losing the fight. The progressive side in the UK was winning, and then Brexit happened. And what happened with Brexit is that all the progressive energy that was going into trans rights sort of got diverted into dealing with Brexit.
Right.
But none of the energy that was being held by the trans exclusionary side dissipated with Brexit, and it just kept pushing harder and harder and harder. And around this time as well, left-wing political spaces in the UK started purging their ranks of the TERFs. So they started getting rid of all these trans exclusionary radical feminists, and then trans issues started to become visible for the first time in around 2016 to most normal people. Most people, unless they knew trans people in their lives or were in the spaces where there tend to be more trans people, didn't know what trans was at all.
Right.
And then they started getting representation in TV shows. People started talking about it more. The discourse sort of broke into the mainstream, and then all of a sudden people were talking about it. And the right wing didn't really know what to do with it, so they kind of started talking about anti-trans stuff like it was gay stuff, and those talking points weren't really effective and they weren't really organized. But all these trans exclusionary radical feminists who knew how to talk about this stuff and who knew all the points to bring up and who had spent the last 5-10 years fighting these fights, all of a sudden they they know how to fight it. And so the heterodox sphere, the podcast bros, all those people who are like, what is this trans thing and what do we do about it? Who do they go to? They go to the only ones who are opposed to it, but also sort of talking in semi-coherent ways about it and not just screeching. And so all the TERFs that get kicked out of left-wing spaces are now going to all these other spaces and talking about things.
Yeah.
And now, especially Christian spaces and Christian spaces in the UK that are trying to figure out the trans issues are looking for people to talk to about it. Who are they going to find? They're going to find the people who were in these left-wing spaces who would they never have contact with, ever. Right. All of a sudden, now they have contact with them. And one of the jokes that I often tell, which is sort of one of those jokes that does have a large kernel of truth to it, is that a lot of autistic Christian women have sort of sleeper cell radfem programming in them. They often develop a lot of the ideas of radical feminism through nothing but the power of autism and the sheer weight of Christian misogyny. It just all these things come together to create a sort of sleeper cell radical feminism. And then for the first time in a lot of Christian women's lives, and autistic Christian women especially, because they tend to be more intellectually engaged and especially more engaged about issues about gender. So autistic Christian men often don't think about gender at all. Autistic Christian women think about it a lot. They're all of a sudden hearing these talking points. They're hearing radical feminists who know they're in Christian spaces. And so they tone down the rhetoric that would offend Christians, and they tone up the rhetoric that they think would align with them. Yep. And you have all these Christian women who would have never heard about radical feminist talking points now getting exposed to them at the same time.
Sure.
And also, when you just look at overlapping internet spaces, so the places where autistic Christian women tend to be and the places where TERFs tend to be they overlap more than you might expect. And so in terms of just like exposure to hearing these types of things, autistic Christian women are just far more exposed to it, far more likely to think about it. And then the tide sort of started turning. In 2020, J.K. Rowling released her famous essay.
Yep.
And that kind of launched everything into the stratosphere in terms of, if you hadn't heard about this before, now you definitely had. And it just like took off with autistic Christian women. And autistic Christian men, almost immune to it, just didn't really go along with it. And we're just like, I don't know, doesn't really bother me, doesn't really affect me. I don't really care. Like, you do you. There's a sort of impulse. So I did 3 episodes on autistic attitudes towards sex and gender. And one of the most common refrains from those episodes is that autistic people are default meritocratic egalitarians, which is to say their default stance is basically, if you have the capability and you have the ability, you should do it. I don't care about anything else. And so autistic men, that sort of kicks in and they're like, whatever, just you do you, if it makes sense. And that's the thing that is going to be most operative in this situation, go for it. Autistic Christian women, however, significantly less chill about that, to put it lightly. And just did not expect to see that coming, but it did. And so like a lot of my close friends who are autistic Christian women who I've met through this just slowly started to get radicalized, are now on the trans exclusionary side, which I didn't expect, but that was a very, very surprising finding. Another one that I briefly talked about was I thought a lot about like religious extremism and things like that. So my background is military intelligence. Before I did this, before I did what I'm doing now, I was in the military for 10 years, and I thought a lot about suicide bombers, because that was just something that I had to think a lot about. And I started realizing there were some patterns and trends. And I was like, oh, this is weird. And so I started asking autistic people what they thought about suicide bombers, and just learning that like there was a lot of sympathy for them. And a lot of them were like, I get it. That makes sense.
Wow.
I was like, oh, wow. Crazy. Cool.
That's really interesting. Huh.
Yeah. And so like just being able to relate to those types of things, I was like, whoa. All right. But those are the 2 kind of most surprising things that I wouldn't have predicted when I started the research, that I just sort of watching the TERF thing happen in real time was kind of wild. It's like, it was really funny because I had a lot of progressive friends, and I was telling them, I was like, guys, you don't understand. Like, this is about to blow up.
Yeah, this is about to get real bad. This is about to blow up in a direction you really don't want it to blow up in. And none of them were taking it seriously, because they're like, John, this is just a weird microcosm that you're in. Like, autistic Christian women aren't representative. I'm like, no, you don't understand. This is the last group of people who should be getting radicalized. Like, right. If they are getting radicalized, that means some really ugly stuff is happening right now. Yeah.
That means if this domino is falling, like, watch out.
Yeah. And I mean, I think you've been pretty, demonstrated to be pretty correct on that. I mean, without getting too far, astride of the topic of the episode, I mean, we peeking behind the curtain, we're recording this on Inauguration Day in the US, and, you can see there is a very much a national right-wing pivot happening right now. And I'm sure that's something that you can just see in the data with the amount of time you've been studying it and the specific era you've been studying it,
Yeah. And like, one of the things that I've noticed is autistic people tend to like prefigure social trends by like 2 or 3 years. So whatever is happening in the mainstream will probably be happening with autistic people 2 years in advance. And so a lot of times it's really funny. I see a new culture war battle coming up. I'm like, oh, I thought we already dealt with that like 2 years ago. It's like, oh, I guess this is hitting the mainstream now. Cool.
Well, yeah, because it makes sense because of the impulse to intellectualize, right? And it's like, in general, a lot of these debates are happening in intellectual spheres before they begin to trickle into pop culture and into the conversations of those who aren't, actively interested in politics or philosophy or whatever.
And also just being extremely online and very, very morally charged. Like autistic people are extremely morally charged. Like there is a clear right and a clear wrong. And so like when they find a moral issue, they usually break hard to one side or the other of it. And so seeing all those things come together, it kind of creates a more clear picture of what's going on. But yeah. Well,
that's the end of what I have, written down for questions here. Is there anything that we didn't get to that you kind of, want to bring up?
That is a great question. I should have thought about that in advance.
Oh, no worries.
I just want to make it clear when, just in case the talking about autistic Christian women all of a sudden becoming TERFs sort of surprises people. This is like a strange anomalous phenomena within autistic Christians. The vast majority of autistic Christians are socially progressive on most issues. I shouldn't say the vast majority, the majority. So like above 50%. So when you look at issues like women's ordination, there's really high support, especially amongst autistic Christian women. It's just this one issue is particularly anomalous, and I mean, there's having spoken to a lot of these people and knowing a lot of them and being friends with a lot of them. Like I understand their reasoning. I don't agree with it, but like I get why they ended up the way they did, and it's just like one of those things where there's a lot of factors that go into these things. And so I don't want anyone to get the wrong impression here, to think that like all autistic people, like some people think that they're like the TERFs are hiding in the trees or something like that whenever I talk about this. And it's not that case. There are many good autistic Christian women who are trans inclusive. And it's not like a universal phenomenon, but it is much larger than a lot of people think it would be. And like the other thing about it is I tell people that and they're like, oh yeah, wow, Christians are transphobic. So surprising.
Right.
It's like, right. It's like, okay, but you don't understand. They're not like Matt Walsh. They're like radical feminists.
Yeah. They're like doing this from a supposedly left-wing angle.
Yes.
Yeah.
When you hear their anti-trans talking points, it's not coming from we need to return to traditional values. It's we need to like fight for women and women's rights. And so it's like it's a particular brand of it that I think is pretty prominent amongst the population. But so that's the surprising thing. But in general, I think like so there's this common refrain and this common phrase that I hear in a lot of autistic communities, especially ones who are deconstructing and deconverting. And the phrase is something to the effect of, Christianity is a religion by neurotypicals for neurotypicals. And what they're expressing in that sentiment is they're basically saying, look, Christianity just isn't for me. There are all these things within Christianity clearly not made with me in mind. The way services are structured, the way all these things are structured, the way they communicate ideas, the way they talk to me, the way they do spiritual advice, none of this is for me. And there's a part of me that's like, yeah, I get that. I completely understand why you would feel that way. But I also think it's important to just emphasize it doesn't have to be that way, right? Like there's no reason that Christianity needs to be done in a way that can't accommodate autistic people. Like there is nothing about autism that makes it incompatible with Christianity. There are forms of Christianity, however, that are incompatible with autism. It's just not all of Christianity, right? Like, Christianity is a very broad tradition with very broad ranges of different expression. And oftentimes I'll find that autistic people are internally syncretic. So they pull theologies from various Christian traditions to sort of create their own special Christian tradition, I guess. But yeah, I see a lot of people being like, Christianity isn't for us. There's no reason that autistic people should be Christian, and I just think that isn't true. Right? Like, I just think that there are many ways that autistic Christians can be, and there are many ways to do Christianity that are perfectly normal and perfectly compatible with autism and Christianity. And I just don't think we talk about those enough. I don't think we emphasize those enough. I don't think we let people know that they exist. And I think if we lived in a world in which forms of Christianity that were more compatible with autism were just seen as normal and seen as a perfectly valid way to do Christianity that might be a little weird, but is ultimately still Christian, I think the sort of problem of autistic people being less likely to be Christian would sort of just go away. Like, there wouldn't be any sort of statistical anomaly there. But yeah, the way to, if you are a Christian invested in, not having, so many autistic people leave the faith, the way to do something about that is to make the faith welcoming to autistic people. Yes. Shocker. Crazy how nature do that. It's, don't be an asshole to these people and they won't leave. And maybe try to accommodate people with disabilities, and they'll stay in your church. Crazy.
Oh wow.
Yeah. No, that's
awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me. This was a really great episode.
Hopefully it goes well. Hopefully I didn't scare people off with the turf fun fact.
No, I don't think so. I mean, that is one data point of many. And I hope, people listening to this, if you found all this interesting, there are many more hours of discussing the issues that came up in this.
many more.
So definitely check out Christianity on the Spectrum. Hey, thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If you like what you heard, make sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts. It helps out with the algorithm, or even just rate the show on Spotify. But if you really like the show, consider supporting the show on Patreon. And hey, one of the benefits you get for supporting this show on Patreon is you get your name read out at the end of every episode. So, without further ado, this episode was brought to you by our lovely patrons, who include Avakai Brodigam, I Drink Corn Syrup, Yum, I'm once again Leo Zachary Dickinson, Philip Cozy, Vita Breva, 2007 Christian Rock, Attention Francis, Derek Hale, Gavin Aronson, Henrik Lane, Kyle Gannis, Metric Conversion, Mitchell McKinley, Moss, Nathan Thiessen, Racecar, Randy Sutton, Regular Sized Horse, parentheses, Small, Robert Eilman, Stephen aka Spike Stonehand, The Worst of All Possible Worlds, Vicky Sutton, Yeens, and of course, Chris Barker. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode, and I will see you for the next episode on the Patreon.